Noi continuăm cu programul de astăzi, care prevede o prezentare publică, alternative, cu participarea lui Jorg Scheller, care este invitatul nostru pentru a participa și conduce un atelier de curatoriat în artă contemporană, ca parte a programului Spații culturale alternative pe care îl organizăm în acest an și care va avea loc la sfârșitul lunii iunie anul curent. Și prezentarea de azi e o contribuție la și o extensie a lucrărilor din cadrul atelierului de azi. Drept scop aveam să vorbim despre să oferim un răspuns la ce este scuzați, un pic s-a obosit, a fost o zi lungă. Apropo, mă bucur că ați supraviețuit în acest moment tot ceilalți. Deci scopul nostru era în ziua de azi, în cadrul atelierului, să răspundem la întrebarea alternativ la ce ne poziționăm noi ca artiști, inițiative culturale, ca organizații sau ca spații culturale. Și în urma acestei prezentări sper să ne revedem inițiativele noastre într-un context mai global, datorită a ceea ce o să auzim în ziua de azi. E plăcerea mea să-l prezint pe Jorg Scheller, care este profesor de istorie arte la Universitatea de Arte din Zurich. La fel este profesor invitat la Universitatea de Arte din Poznan, din Polonia. Dincolo de asta, noi am învățat că e și un muzician și are o formație malmuzeit și livrează metale grele sau heavy metal, muzică de heavy metal, la solicitarea noastră a tuturor care avem nevoie de așa un serviciu asemănător celui de livrarea pizzei. Dar totodată Jorg e cel care e și un trainer de fitness certificat și e pasionat de bodybuilding. Și dumnealui în proiectele sale, în practica sa curatorială și de cercetător și de critic de arte, le combine pe toate acestea la un loc. Deci îi oferim cuvântul să vorbească despre acest subiect și la sfârșit vă încurajăm să adresați întrebări. Jorg, I will shortly introduce you and please take the floor.
Yeah, thank you so much. Okay, so welcome to the last lecture of this long day. And I will talk a bit about how the notion of alternative has changed in the last years and what kind of alternative understandings of alternative are circulating these days. And just to begin with, I will start with some personal remarks. What it was like growing up in Western Germany in the 1980s and then unified Germany in the 1990s. As a teenager, one was confronted with the notion of so-called alternative rock or alternative metal, or I don't know what. So the notion of alternative was all over the place, had alternative music magazines, etc., etc. So growing up this way, one grew up with a diffuse understanding that alternative somehow meant good. Yeah. So the term alternative had this connotation of we are something different, somewhat different than those bad ones, whoever that was, the majority society, the conservatives, I don't know what. So that was at least how I grew up, or the environment in which I grew up as a teenager, these were the connotations. And until today, I think the connotations of alternative are somewhat positive in many milieux. So for instance, when you look at this example from Berlin, there is the so-called alternative culture in Berlin, and the alternative culture has to be protected against the capitalists and against the bourgeoisie and so on and so on. So it's the underdog and it's the big players, and the underdog is alternative. So this here we have the same connotation as maybe in alternative rock. But you find the term also, for instance, in agriculture, in terms of modern agriculture alternatives, sustainable farming methods. So speaking of agriculture, alternative culture means agriculture that is not yet fully industrialized, that is not fully appropriated by capitalism, etc., etc. So I'm telling this just to show that at least in the context that I'm touching on here, alternative was meant to be something good and something that goes against the grain of the majority. So that has changed. Ever since the early 2000s and the 2010s, at the latest with the emergence of the so-called alt-right. So alt-right is an abbreviation for alternative right. So far right-wing parties or far right-wing movements, to be more precise, that claim to be the true alternative. I will go into detail later. The bottom line is always that you have a majority society that is left liberal. So the alternative means conservative right. So that has shifted. And ever since like the last couple of years at the latest, particularly when it comes to online communities, when it comes to social networks, etc., the term alternative rather resonates with the far right, whereas the left, mid-left, left progressives do not use the term so often anymore. One is a little bit cautious because one knows about these guys. So I will come back to this later if it actually makes sense to let this guy determine your use of language. I will give some remarks about this in the end. In Germany, we saw the emergence of a new party in 2013, the so-called Alternative für Deutschland, Alternative for Germany. And here you have the same or a similar principle as in the so-called alt-right, namely a conservative or regressive right-wing to far-right party is appropriating this notion and claiming that no, now it is us who are the alternative. Now it's us who go against the grain, who are the rebels. It's us who defend liberal open culture. As you, for instance, see in this instance, this is from 2019. It's a large campaign poster by the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, where they use this salon painting by Gérôme from the 19th century, showing a slave market where you cannot really tell with which ethnicity it is, but the skin of the woman is remarkably lighter than the skin of those selling her on the slave market. So the headline reads, we don't want Europe to become Eurabia. So Europes are in danger of becoming slaves to Arab nations whatsoever, and therefore you have to vote for the alternative, that is the alternative for Germany, the party. So showing you these introductory examples to underline that the notion has really changed. So today in Germany, when you hear the term alternative or alternative, people no longer think of alternative rock from the 1990s. You don't think of Pearl Jam or whatsoever. They think about this stuff. So I started dealing with the Alternative für Deutschland and the new right and the old right roughly 10 years ago, started writing articles about them, analyzing the policies in the press. For instance, how the AfD is treating German Romanticism. So basically they use the Romantic era, the era around 1800, as an alternative to official history writing of today. So the real German spirit lies in the Romantic era. And by Romantic era, they mean the national movement in the early 19th century, anti-Napoleonic, anti-France movement. So in this article, I show that in order to root Germany in the Romantic era, they kind of divide the Romantic era, because we had an early Romantic era, late 18th century, where Romanticism was actually quite hybrid and fluid and progressive, already dealing with what you would call today gender issues, for instance. So in order to have the Romantic era as a main reference point for Germany, they have to divide Romanticism and exclude one part of Romanticism. So this is how it always goes, and we will see that this is a pattern that shows up throughout the new right and the old right and the old right as well. So I wrote a couple more articles about this topic, also in academic books, and came up with some basic conclusions or some basic questions that I've been dealing with ever since. So what we can observe is that the new right, the so-called alt-right that emerged in the early 21st century, the new right actually emerged in the 1960s. I will also talk about this later. That they use new or alternative aesthetic means for conservative or reactionary purposes. So we no longer have this natural connection between a reactionary aesthetic, like people painting forests and like heroes, soldiers, stuff like this, and the reactionary mind. But we have a much more loose and versatile and fluid connection between mindset and aesthetics. And I was wondering if this is actually so new. So if the far right movements or extreme right movements have always been, until recently, reactionary in terms of aesthetics as well, or if we find examples of early far-right movements who have the same, or make the same use of aesthetics as the new right or alt-right. So for me it became very important to study the role of appropriation and the use of alternative aesthetics in the history of far-right movements. And in the following I will give you a short overview that maybe shows that the so-called new right are actually not so new. This will be one of the focus points. Appropriation plays a key role in this one. This is another campaign poster by the Alternative für Deutschland. that says, burqas, we favor bikinis. So this is one, it's interesting. Yeah? It's a far-right party with an even more extreme youth wing within the party, so they are more radical. But when you think of the far-right aesthetics in Europe, you think of, you don't think of this. Yeah? You don't think of bikinis. You think of like dogs, soldiers, stone monuments. You think of the Olympia Stadium in Berlin, stuff like this, like this military aesthetics, or like the old conservative realism in the broadest sense. So what the AFD is doing here is basically they appropriate ideas and aesthetics that were rather associated, for instance, with the '68 movement in Europe. Yeah? Like freedom of bodily expression, women no longer having to hide their bodies in public, as it is the case in reactionary systems or in theocratic systems. So, like showing naked bodies was understood as something progressive, 1960s, 1970s. So the AFD basically argues with this poster, we are now the new '68 movement. Yeah? We are the ones who protect Europe from becoming like a colony of Islamic countries, and we will guarantee, like our women, that they can dress as they want in public, that they can wear bikinis if they want, and nobody will force them to wear a burqas.
What is a burqa? Yeah.
Burqa? It's the full body covering. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Only eyes.
Yeah. You can only. Sometimes you cannot even see the eyes. Which is actually not in the Quran. So it's a much later invention by some like derivatives of Islam, radical strands. So I think this is exemplary how many new right or alt-right parties and movements operate. They appropriate the aesthetics, the rhetoric, and also the ideals of left-wing, left progressive, progressive left, left liberal movements in the broadest sense. So the self-understanding, for instance, of the AFD and of many new right and alt-right is that conservatism is the new avant-garde. So if you go against the grain of the public opinion of the majority of society, you have to be conservative. Because the line of argument is, in Western countries, everybody now loves to be liberal, open society, left-leaning progressivist. So if you want to be a rebel, countercultural guy, you become conservative. So there is the idea of the conservative avant-garde. And thereby, implicitly, they also appropriate or assimilate the socialist and communist connotations. Because mostly, also when I studied art history, avant-garde was associated with early communism. So early Soviet art, Malevich, Rodchenko, etc., etc. I will show later that this is actually not quite correct. But they also make use of this connotation and twist it, basically. So is this an act of cultural appropriation? So today we discuss a lot about cultural appropriation. It's all over the place at my university and the newspapers that I work for. The term cultural appropriation actually presupposes that a certain culture is the property of a certain group. Otherwise, you cannot appropriate. So, Which is an interesting thing. When you take the notion of cultural appropriation seriously, you imply that culture can be a property. Otherwise, it cannot be appropriated. So therefore, I am always a little bit suspicious when talking of cultural appropriation, because I think culture cannot be a property in a strict sense. But today we discuss about culture sometimes in this way, that a certain group is entitled to use certain elements and another group is not entitled to use these cultural elements. And if we view these appropriations in this through this lens, we can actually we could assume that here we have an act of cultural appropriation, because like these progressive aesthetics, they rather belong to the left. Yeah? Let's put it very roughly and very bluntly. So they appropriate it, they make use of it themselves. So the question is this actually the case? For instance, when we look at Kazimir Malevich, for instance, I go back to the early, like pre-Russian Revolution era. This is something that is commonly associated with the term avant-garde. So when you open an art history book about avant-garde, you will probably come across Kazimir Malevich. And also the term avant-garde as such was coined in the context of the arts by a socialist banker, actually in the 1820s, namely Olinda Rodriguez. I brought you a quote from an article from Mutual Art. Vladimir will probably send you the presentation afterwards so you can read it. I just put it in to show you that also the term avant-garde in the context of the arts comes from a socialist and communist background. It's 1820s, Olinda Rodriguez was a disciple of the radical proto-communist Henri de Saint-Simon. He appropriated the military term, because then avant-garde was military, so he appropriated the term from the military and applied it in the context of art, saying that we, the artists, we are the army of progress. Nobody can bring progress like we can. So also here you have an act of appropriation, as it were. So this just to underline the argument that avant-garde has this like leftist, social progressivist connotations, which then really culminated in the Russian and Soviet avant-garde art. But, there's a but. As you can see here, famous exhibition from 1915, where Malevich put his black square in the upper corner of the exhibition space, was entitled "The Last Futurist Exhibition." And futurism was a term that was coined not in Russia at that point, but it was coined already in 1909 in Italy. And that was the proto-fascist era. So the Russian artists, which were then also in Russia called futurist artists, got their inspiration from the early futurist artists in Italy. Many of them became affiliated with the fascist regime later on that came to power in 1922. But before that, it was a hybrid mixture of anarchism, socialism, reactionary stuff, authoritarian. So the early fascist, proto-fascist movement was pretty hybrid. Just as a footnote, also in Germany, we had the same situation. The movements leading up to the National Socialist regime were actually quite diverse. So you had nudists, for instance, who later became like staunch Nazi dissidents. You had a left wing in national like socialism, Strasser brothers, and so on. So and then it became consolidated in the 1930s. So the Russian avant-gardists were inspired by the Italian futurists, who kind of, maybe not appropriated, but they occupied the popular press for their first big public manifesto that was published in the Figaro, so in the French newspaper in 1909, was written by Marinetti. And Marinetti, he was really like a strong fascist believer. And he also became involved in cultural policies in the Mussolini regime. So we have this strange context of the notion, when you now look back, like 1980s, 90s alternative rock, like the avant-garde as an alternative to official or salon art, the early futurism, proto-fascist art that emerged in the early 20th century. So it's an interesting line of evolution. Now, when we look at the fascist aesthetic that emerged then in the 1920s and 1930s, we see that Italian fascism was a bit different from, for instance, National Socialist Germany, because the aesthetic was much more hybrid and in like some ways open. And this became, for instance, visible in the 1932 traveling exhibition Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista, so a traveling exhibition commemorating the rise to power in 1922. So when you look at this exhibition, especially the way it is curated and the exhibition is designed, it is really avant-garde. So this was really top-notch, latest, innovative stuff that was presented here. So there you see this hyper, like fragmented, dynamized exhibition design. Usually you associate fascist aesthetics with very like clear stuff, authoritative stuff that you don't have to interpret. But here you're rather confused. Yeah, it's collage, fragmented stuff. So really something that we today would rather associate with early Soviet avant-garde before it became socialist realism, obviously, and Stalinized and so on. So here's another example from this, from the Mostra della Rivoluzione Fascista in 1932. You see, this is a wall of the exhibition that really celebrates hybridity. For instance, you have like sculptural elements, you have typographic elements, and you even have like photo objects. So photographs printed onto three-dimensional objects. That was really progressive for that time. Very experimental. So here you have a clear instance of an alternative aesthetics that was put in the power of reactionary, or in this case, authoritarian, totalitarian regime. When you think of Walter Benjamin and his theory about avant-garde aesthetics, Walter Benjamin would associate the collage with something progressive because it is fragmented and it does not form a coherent whole. This example shows you that collaging can actually be instrumentalized for reactionary purposes, for authoritarian purposes as well. So here we have clearly an alternative aesthetics. Now, to further complicate the issue, you see that this exhibition design was in turn inspired by Soviet exhibition design and curating styles. Because in the 1920s, Lisitsky, for instance, he would design the pavilions or exhibitions for the Soviet regime. He would use pretty much the same aesthetics or exhibition designs or designs of display that the fascists would use later on. So we have a constant exchange, we have a constant traveling, we have constant instances of appropriation between different regimes. And I think, as we will see later, this is quite the case today as well. So I'm showing you these examples from the past to outline that what we experience today is maybe not so new. So I'm giving you one example for really a direct inspiration, appropriation between Soviet and fascist exhibitions. This is the figurine, The Woman and the Press, designed by Lisitsky for the Casa exhibition, so an exhibition dedicated to the press, as the name subtly suggests. And it's about the liberation of women in communism, or the alleged liberation of women in communism. And you will find pretty much a very similar figurine in the fascist context. Here you have a member of the stormtroopers of the Arditi, who is clearly modeled on a female figurine from the Pesa exhibition, but of course he's not printed with texts and images celebrating the liberation of women, but with a fascist warfare. So the images are traveling between both ideologies, and obviously they have also similarities with Dada exhibition designs, or Dada styles of curating, fragmented style of curating, a very frantic, dynamized style of curating, as you can see here by the example of the Dada Fair in 1920. So again, nothing that we would spontaneously associate with totalitarian or authoritarian, regressive, reactionary, revanchist aesthetics. And we could go on, even like moving on into the future 1950s, a similar way of conceiving exhibitions, of curating exhibitions, of designing exhibitions, you will find in the context of pop culture, pop art. Here, this is tomorrow, famous exhibition, the Whitechapel Gallery in London, one of the early instances of pop art. So again, fragmented, blow-ups, collage elements, three-dimensional objects, prints, all being aligned together. So, when we speak of the contemporary new right or alt-right appropriating aesthetics from left-leaning groups, progressivist groups, liberal contexts, I would argue this is actually nothing new. The contemporary alt-right or new right is not so new. It stands in the tradition of early Italian fascism that appropriated, among others, elements of anarchism. So the early fascists, they were still inspired by anarchism. And then they included elements from Soviet exhibitions, but the Soviets in turn were inspired by the futurists who were associated with the fascists, etc. So alternative, I would argue, is really like ideologically unspecific. But this term, this notion, is not tied to a certain ideology, or it cannot be tied to a certain ideologic group, movement, although I, as a naive teenager, grew up believing that this is the case. Alternative meaning something good, progressive, open, I don't know what. So alternative aesthetics or rhetoric can serve different socio-political purposes, really depending on the contextualizing and framing. So it's not about the aesthetic as such, it's about what you do with the aesthetics. The framing, the contextualization, the performativity of these elements, if you like. And today, this is precisely what is happening. So, for instance, when you read the main authors of the New Right, or those who inspired the alt-right, also those who inspired like parts of the Kremlin, of the Putin regime, you will find like the term alternative all over the place. For instance, in the writings of Alexander Dugin. Probably many of you have heard about him. He's a theoretician, philosopher, who some say his role is overestimated, but let's say he coined some ideas, some notions that are now very prevalent in the Putin regime. So when you read his texts, it's alternative all over the place. If we think about an alternative and correlate it with the existing blueprint for the future, then we should clearly understand what that alternative is going to replace. The answer is simple. Liberalism as the dominant global discourse. Therefore, the only significant alternative should logically be directed against liberalism. And there we will come back to this later. You see the binary structure is alive and well. It's either or. If this is the enemy, then that must be my friend. So at the very the fundament of reactionary or authoritarian or totalitarian thinking is and remains this binary thinking in friend and foe. So this, it's a little bit like saying, okay, it has rained for 4 years now. Everybody is drowning, so we need now at least 8 years of only sunshine. No rain anymore, then we will be much better. That is the logic if you take that serious. So if that is bad, then that must be good. Here, interestingly, you see that the main enemy of the authors of the New Right, alt-right, and various other reactionary, revanchist, regressive, conservative movements, they vary to a great extent, so it's not all the same, but they mostly identify, interestingly, liberalism as the main enemy. So Alain de Benoit, I don't know if you're familiar with him, he's like one of the founding fathers of the New Right. He has been active since the 1960s, and he has remained one of the most influential theoreticians of the newer right-wing movements. And he clearly states that the enemy today is not the left-wingers, as you would expect. He says it's the liberals. The liberals are worst, because the liberals, they destroy everything. For them, it's like anything goes. The world is a marketplace. Everybody has sex with everybody. All the cultures mingle. There's no more borders. Everybody's just trading stuff and enriching themselves. Nobody really cares for culture. Nobody has values anymore. And the left-wingers at least have this. So they still believe in something. So they treat the left wing like seriously, the New Right. So they can accept them. But the liberals, they are really the worst. They're like a cloud, like a toxic cloud. And it's obvious why this is the case, because they cannot fit like the liberal in-between into the either-or scheme. And if it's not good or bad, then it must be worse. so or worst in this case. If they cannot really grab it, if they cannot like put it in a binary scheme, then it must be the real debt. And Alain de Benoit, we will come back to him. He was one of the main proponents of, say, like cultural appropriation when it comes to left-wing ideas, aesthetics, theories, and so on. So he kind of inspired many others to do this. So when we look at the new right and alt-right, we see that cultural appropriation, I use the term for the sake of simplicity, I think it's sometimes a little misleading, but I think we know what it's meant. They use cultural appropriation to disrupt order and to create confusion, to put it very roughly. So if I take like elements from the left wing, again very roughly speaking, and use them for right-wing purposes, people get confused because they can no longer determine by the signs or the aesthetic what is it? Is it progressive? Is it regressive? Is it left? Is it right? So you get confused, and if you're confused, you look for clarity and authority, and this is precisely what they want to have. So they try to lure you into confusion in order to, to make you want to desire clarity and authority. And this is why they use like countercultural, subcultural aesthetics a lot as door openers to new audiences. So if you boil it down, you can say, and I will give you some examples briefly, liberal aesthetics are used against liberalism, left ideas are turned against left politics. For instance, when you look at skinheads, when I grew up, 1980s, 1990s, I was told in school, beware of skinheads. Skinheads are Nazis. Yeah? They're National Socialists, they're far right. This is what I learned. But actually, skinheads were not that in the beginning, in the late 1960s, early 1970s. They were either apolitical or they hang out with black kids in East London. You know? White guys shaving their heads, listening to black music. Yeah, ska, reggae, and so on. Yeah? So this act of cultural appropriation, like right-wingers appropriating the hairstyle of skinheads, meant that the skinheads were taken, they were deprived of one of their trademarks, if you like. So you have many like anti-fascist skinheads. You have the reggae skins, the ska skins, the sharp skins, the anarchist skins, etc., etc. But today, when you hear skinhead, most people would think, right-wing, Nazi, etc. So that, I would say, is like an act of cultural appropriation. You take the element away from your enemy, you transform it into something that you can use for yourself, for your own purposes. And there's many more examples of like skinheads that have nothing to do with like the Nazi movement, with the new right, alt-right, and whatsoever. So, for instance, like straight-edge hardcore skins, like drug-free punk rockers in the 1970s, 80s, 90s onward. You also had skinheads, but not in a political sense. It was more like clean living and so on. But, yes, the operation was kind of successful. People think of skinheads as Nazis. And this is precisely like this technique, this method, you will find, for instance, in the Trump camp. So Trump is using aesthetics, for instance, meme aesthetics, various online aesthetics rather associated with the liberal left for his political purposes. So it's really like a detachment, taking an aesthetic out of its context, translating it to a different context and making it productive there, and creating confusion. Yeah? I thought this was a kind of like a funny, progressive thing, this meme stuff, but Trump is doing it, so yeah. People, there's a sort of sense of disorientation. Angela Nagel has written about this. I don't know if some of you are familiar with her book. I recommend it to you if you're interested in like culture wars, online wars, aesthetics of the alt-right, new right, and so on. Because there she really, I think, she argues quite convincingly how the alt-right, the new right operate, and I quote, the alt-right is occupied with creating an alternative to the right-wing conservative establishment, who they dismiss as conservatives for their soft Christian passivity and for metaphorically calling their womenfolk nation race to the non-white foreign invader. Yeah? So, this is Angela Nagel's take on the topic. And another quote, the style being channeled by the peep and meme posting trolls and online transgressive follows a tradition that can be traced from the 18th century writings of the Marquis de Sade, surviving through the 19th century Parisian avant-gardes, the surrealists, the rebel rejection of feminized conformity of post-war America, and then to what film critics called 1990s male rampage films like American Psycho and Fight Club. So these are the sources that they draw from. Richard Spencer, who's one of the leading figures of the US alt-right and the white supremacists, he longs for a more intellectual European style of blood and soil nationalism, and he said in an interview that he used to want to be an avant-garde theater director. So this is the situation that we face. And interestingly, Angela Nagel, she does not include the early phase of fascism, Mussolini, futurism. So that is left out in the book. So she refers mostly to, say, like left-leaning avant-garde movements, or nonconformist, apolitical stuff. Male rampage films doesn't have a clear political agenda. And I think that is one of the blind spots of the book, because I think you understand the alternative right only when you take into account the heritage of futurism and early fascism. This is the source where they actually draw from. So when we see a phenomenon like Fash Wave, for instance, this is like one of these online phenomena, part of the ongoing culture wars online. We could observe more than 10 years ago already how far-right online activists appropriated the so-called vaporwave aesthetic. Yeah? And vaporwave was clearly Tumblr, left, liberal, progressives. Yeah? So like soft and stoned and stuff like this. So nothing that a true right-wing hero can identify with. But they took it, they appropriated it, and they turned it into so-called fashion. So it's basically a gesture of like, I don't care what aesthetic that is. I just take it, I have the power to do so. So it's a demonstration of power. No one is safe. I can occupy, I can appropriate, all of you. Yeah? No matter how you try to differentiate yourself, like aesthetically, from us, from the right-wingers, yeah? We will get you. Yeah? You can do whatever you want. We will take your bikini, we will take your vaporwave, we will take all sorts of alternative aesthetics and turn it into something that benefits us. Yeah? So from like this emerged from the alt-right, we went to art-right, which is another like online culture wars phenomenon, artistic processing of online aesthetics. We have observed Milo Yiannopoulos one of the early alt-right influencers who tried to reconcile LGBTQ issues with right-wing mentality, so he became famous as like this gay right-wing influencer. And he toured the United States with the Dangerous Faggot Tour, appropriating the rainbow flag and all sorts of other aesthetics, comic aesthetics, and I don't know what. We saw a white nationalist hacker, Andrew Auernheimer, who, if you would meet him like somewhere like down the street in Chișinău, you probably would think, what a nice like little hipster. Like he is probably engaged in some NGO that takes care of, I don't know, organic wheat production, or I don't know, stuff like this. A guy that hangs out in co-working spaces, wears funny T-shirts, but when you look a little bit closer at the T-shirt, you might already get an impression where he's from. And when he takes a T-shirt off, you will see swastika tattoos. So yeah. But still, on the surface, like, nice guy, he's a nice guy. Yeah? And this is what I mean by creating confusion. You disrupt the order of science. Yeah? And this is a demonstration of power. You have the power to disrupt the order. You disrupt the order, chaos emerges. If chaos emerges, people fear. If people fear, they want authority. If they want authority, they vote authority. So that's basically how things work. I give another example, I think a very impressive telling example. This is Melanie Schmitz. She is an activist from the identitarian movement, so other far-right European movement that can be subsumed under the new right and alt-right term. And her social media accounts have all been shut down, so she has been like expelled. Instagram and all the other social media platforms, but I took screenshots many years ago, so knowing that this would likely come. And I found her example really quite telling for with regard to alternatives and how the new right and alt-right operates in terms of cultural appropriation. So I will go through her Instagram account. I'll give you a little guided tour, how she presented herself on Instagram. So we start with something really, as you could imagine, like rather girl, a young woman interested in like experimental dance and maybe a little bit like ecology, stuff like this, because like the early movements, like experimental dance movements, was also tied to early ecology movements. So you maybe would have this associated. If you would see only the picture, no context, you would probably not think, maybe she's an alt-right activist. So, and also the next image.
What does the identitarian movement say? What are they about?
In a nutshell, they say that there is a European identity that needs to be protected from the outside world, and above all from Islam. Okay. So it's not only about national identity, they still cling to that as well, but first and foremost they are concerned with preserving a European identity. Mm-hmm. And as we will see, and I think this Instagram account really shows that this identity is now conceived in a much more hybrid and plural way than the old right-wing identities. But, as we will also see, the binary scheme of us and them is still intact. So if you continue, next example, you see her squatting in the gym. You would probably think, wow, an emancipated woman. No, she's doing the hard labor in the gym. Back in the days, Like the women would be on the stepper doing gymnastics, like Jane Fonda and stuff. But she's really doing the boys' stuff now. Like, great, yeah, very emancipatory thing. Then you go on and you see, aha, like almost kissing a girl in the club. You would also not associate this first and foremost with a right-wing mentality. Yeah? Rather something that, like the old right-wing would have despised that. Okay, go on. You will find her probably shortly after having read the entire work of Sartre, no, or Camus, some existentialist and philosophical stuff from the 1950s or 60s, now thinking about what Sartre has to say to us today, smoking a cigarette. Also, again, you would probably not think, probably identitarian activist. And you would find this image, black metal girl. Okay, maybe you would think about like these black metal guys, they were a little bit suspicious in the 1990s, and they were actually identitarian, but like a woman posing a black metal shirt, not necessarily. Rather an act of transgression. The next photo you will find her next to a wall writing, "All power to the working class." So she is in solidarity with the working class. And again, you would probably, without any context, you would not think. Sorry? The guns.
Oh, okay.
So workers, peasants, take the guns. Take the guns. Comment says, "You're really pretty." Like, so, Next thing, posing right not next to the working class, but to a Christmas tree. Here we find her in a hip hop posture, posing on the trunk of a car, Adidas fashion. Again, you would probably not necessarily associate it with right-wing mentalities. This maybe, yes. If you know the Smiths, yes. Then okay. If you know about Morrissey and where he's heading at from time to time, okay, we'll say okay. But still, there are many apolitical, Smith fans out there who really appreciate the music, and it is great. This one has to admit, even right-wingers can produce, or far-right is a difficult term, but far-right-wingers, they can produce great art. It's like that. It has been in fascism, it was this way. With the Smiths, it's not that drastic, but maybe a bit similar. Here, you find her as a hippie girl with a gigantic sunflower, also a little bit Lolita-ish. Here you find her in the bathtub, influencer style. What influencers do, like drinking organic tea in the bathtub, looking melancholic. Again, Lolita style, and doing what we have just been doing backstage. So this goes on and on and on, going on a hike, hanging out with her boyfriend at the lake, and so on and so on. And now, like the identitarian movement, as I told you, it has been banned pretty much from public space. You won't find any accounts of identitarian activists anymore. The movement is in decline. It's supervised by various, not secret services, but in Germany it's called like Verfassungsschutz. So it's an institution like protecting the constitution of the state. So they are now under the radar of this institution. So it has become hard for them to operate. So just to show that it's not just like a playful organization, but they meant things quite serious, and they were also then treated as serious. Yeah. And I think Melanie Schmitz is really a paradigmatic example for like how the new right and alt-right operates now, because what she's doing here, or what she has been doing here on this Instagram account, is basically trying to show I am the real emancipated Western woman. Look at my life. Like, I'm a right-wing woman and I can do whatever I want. I go to the gym, I take some drugs, I listen to the Smiths, but I can also be like Lolita if I feel like. Yeah? I can squat, I can travel, I can read Sartre, I can read left-wing theory, whatever I want. Look, I am truly free. Now, what is endangering this freedom? It's the migrants. Migrants, and particularly the Muslim migrants, they will take away my freedom and they will take away your freedom as well. So, in a way, she's doing something. She's really becoming or has become like an influencer, like a right-wing Kim Kardashian, constantly transforming, which is actually something really like, yes, postmodernish left-wing progressivist, like the performative self, the self that is capable of changing. Whereas like the old conservative right-wing self was a very like stable, fixed self that has to be protected against changes or from changes. And she's trying, or she has been like trying to combine this. Like the stable self means the Western self, the European self, but this performative identity, this fluid identity, is essentialized. Yeah? So that is the new essence of identity. And this essence of identity has to be protected. Like back in the days, you had to protect German identity from French identities. Yeah? You had to preserve these identities. So the pattern is intact. But the identity is conceived in a different way. So she's doing what artists like Cindy Sherman have been doing, like playing with masks, playing with identity constructions, but for a quite different purpose. So the purpose changes, the intentions change, but the methods are comparable. So, when you compare this to, say, like traditional right-wing propaganda in Germany, they were much more direct and outspoken in the past. So basically, when you read like the Nationalist Party, the NPD, in Eastern Germany, they had posters showing this. This is a true Thüringer, so a true
inhabitant of
Thuringia, and this is a false Thuringia. And there you have the blonde Maria, truly German, blonde, blue-eyed, and there you have the Sharia. And you want the true blonde German, you don't want the Sharia. So it's really like very binary, very simple. Take this or that. So here you can read from the aesthetic, from the structure, you can read the ideology. With Melanie Schmitz, it's much more complicated. You really have to dig through what is at the bottom. So as I pointed out already, like repeatedly, the us against them, the binary scheme is still there, but it is kind of like buried under a different, much more progressive looking aesthetic. And this has a lot to do with this act of appropriation that I talked about in the beginning. Now let us come to the last part of the presentation, namely to cat content. Very important. So I argued in the beginning that for the new right and the alt-right it is important not to appear as boring old conservatives or like the old Nazis, like the soldier types. That does not work anymore these days. In order to win over the audience, the public, you have to be a little bit, you have to be like sexy, countercultural, against the grain, interesting. So, what do you do? Well, you appropriate cat content. Why? Now we have to think about what kind of animal, what kind of symbolic animal is the cat. The cat is the anti-dog. The dog follows the rules. You say sit, the dog sits. Okay, not all dogs do, but ideally the dog is like a soldier. You say sit, the dog sits. Now the cat you cannot control. The cat is an intellectual and artistic being. And by associating yourself with cats, you automatically become much more interesting, rebellious, independent, autonomous, artistic, intellectual. So if you choose the cat as the totem, as your totem animal, you gain in cultural capital, if you like. Nobody wants to be a dog. I mean, people want to have dogs, but they don't want to be a dog. But they want to be like cats, freewheeling, have their own mind, not listening to what the majority society says. So increasingly often you will find far-right and alt-right members who like cats. So Melanie Schmitz here is petting a cat. This is Geert Wilders from the Netherlands. You will find him often like petting like this super tiny, super sweet pussycats. You will find this guy, Alain de Benoit, whom I mentioned already. So maybe the founding father of new right and alt-right and a theory, who has been active since the 1960s, as I mentioned. And tellingly, the founding father of the new right and alt-right theories, he is really, he not only has cats, but he lives among cats. So journalists visiting his house tell that there's cats everywhere. And that really resonates with his ideology. He started out in the 1960s as part of a really extremist right-wing movement that also committed attacks, so they used violence. But then they found out, okay, no, it doesn't work. State is too strong, we cannot win. So what we have to do is we have to win culture. So we have to win the cultural courtyard first. And then, only then, can we win the rest. So it does not work with violence. So this is why he developed this strategy of the so-called meta-politics. He knew they will not vote for me if I define myself openly as extreme right-wing whatsoever. We have to do things a little bit more subtly, more intellectually, artistically, interestingly. So he developed what could be called like the cat content of the recent right-wing movements. Many theories who, when you read them at first glance, they don't seem to be so dangerous or so. He even shares many diagnoses with the left. He's against capitalism and so on and so on. But when you read closely and when you know where he comes from, you will see the binary us versus them is still pretty much intact. I found this image of Jordan Peterson also petting a cat. Those of you who have read 12 Rules for Life, so the best-selling book for desolate men, there's rule number 12, pet a cat when you encounter one on the street. And it's telling that he is petting a cat, not a dog, when he encounters it on the street.
Yeah, because the dog can
But you will also find some nice dogs. But true, cats. And then, last but not least, and of course, Mussolini was a cat owner. Of course, I mean, he has a dictator's cat, so a little bit bigger one. But it's interesting that, or kind of it fits into this scheme, that if you want to be a renegade, a rebel, more interesting, not so boring like that German dictator, like Hitler with a shepherd dog. I mean, yeah, this was much more avant-garde. So here we have this connection. The avant-garde, fascism, cat content. That is the alternative that I think is very much at work today still. Yeah? These new right-wingers and alt-right-wingers, they stand in the line of tradition that goes from Mussolini to today, not necessarily Hitler. So people, at least in German-speaking world, they stare at Hitler, they stare at the National Socialists, they should look more closely to the Italian fascist movement. This is where the aesthetics and many of the ideas of the new right and old right come from. I brought you two cartoons. Dog obedience school and cat obedience school. If you want to be a true rebel, you have seen like Melanie Schmitz, she called herself Rebellany on Instagram, so that was her her second name. If you want to be a true rebel, of course you don't associate yourself with dogs because they don't rebel usually. Cats rebel all the time. And another one, obedience school and disobedience school. So, to conclude and also to draw some practical conclusions from what I have just outlined, it's nothing new, obviously, but I would stress again that the relationship between sign and signify is open and to a large extent arbitrary and conventional. So we cannot argue that there is something such a progressive or left-wing aesthetic or right-wing aesthetic. Everything can be appropriated and used for different purposes. So for me this means one must not let reactionaries dictate the choice of words and make concepts taboo. Unfortunately, this is happening at the moment, especially when it comes to language. I observe this in the German-speaking world now. So, we have the Alternative für Deutschland. Okay, we should no longer speak about alternatives because this is a right-wing term now. Or the libertarians, they speak of freedom. Oh, that's a taboo term now. Freedom, no, this is like Elon Musk libertarian stuff. So I think this one should not let happen, because if you do this, they dictate your choice of what words you use, what concepts you use, what aesthetics you use, and so on and so on. And that happens in the minds of people quite quickly. When you're on social networks, on internet, on Twitter or so, it happens all the time that you use a certain word, you use a certain sign and aesthetic, and people will argue, this is a right-wing thing to do. And it's precisely what you do with it. It's not in the sign, it's not in the aesthetic, it's not in the word. Third conclusion that I draw from this: attempts to create confusion should not be followed by overreaction and self-censorship. So as I outlined, why do they culturally appropriate? They try to destabilize. Great confusion, people long for authority, and so on. So if you overreact, you create particularly this kind of confusion that they want. They want you to be afraid of what is happening and so on. And there I think one should be rather, you cannot be relaxed, obviously, but panicking should not be the answer. So the moral panic that they try to create should not be answered with moral panic. Because this always means that you put yourself in a much weaker position. It's them who bring you to panic. And the fifth, and I think this is very much in line actually with what Oberlicht, for instance, is doing, and in line with what many of you are doing. The alternatives to the new alternatives consist in the creation of broad, pluralist civil society networks. Because at the bottom line, they try to divide and conquer. They try to pit one group against the other. And if they succeed in this, well, then they have succeeded. But if there exists a strong social fabric of people who know each other and of groups who know each other, who are not so easily dividable and not so easily pitted against each other, then it's much harder for them to use the strategies and tactics that I have just portrayed here. So I think a broad and stable social pluralist fabric is the best antidote against these strategies or tactics, methods that I just tried to portray. That was it. Thank you for your attention. Thanks.
But at the end, like, we didn't saw any picture with Melanie saying that she is Italian.
No, she did that on many occasions. I mean, she participated in public gatherings and manifestations. She even sang a song at an AFD party and so on. So she was very clearly a member of this. And she still is, from what one hears. But she has withdrawn. I think she became pregnant 2 years ago. And ever since then, she has kind of withdrawn from the public. But she never quit the movement, for instance. But no, that is well known. She was an outspoken and an open activist for the identitarian movement.
And on the first photo, she used black and yellow colors, and this is the colors of the movement.
Yeah.
Okay.
True. Yeah. Good observation. Yeah. And if you know it, it kind of makes sense. But if you don't know it, there's nothing to worry about. I also wear black and yellow from time to time.
I have a question.
Sure.
What do you think about swastika? It's a very old symbol and it exists in different cultures. Do you think that banning this symbol was a mistake?
Yeah. Yes. We had an instance. I give a story from Switzerland. The singer and guitar player of Bölzer, the band that played at the Metamorphosen exhibition that I curated, he's tattooed, all over his body you find tattoos. And among others, he has some swastikas here on his elbow, which was never a problem until, I think some Antifa account made that public. So they went online, they put it on Twitter, Facebook, whatsoever, and arguing, okay, this guy must be a Nazi because he has swastikas on his arm tattooed. And he's a guy, and he's muscular, so everything made sense. They did not do any research whatsoever. They just claimed, okay, the symbol means this. It's like with the skinheads. You shave your head, you're right wing. Okay. So, and that went viral, obviously, because it's now an internationally known band. And it caused a huge shitstorm, all sorts of allegations were raised, and so on and so on. And so the singer of Bölzer, his name is Okoy Jones, he initially decided not to do anything, not to respond to it, because he found it so stupid that he did not want to engage in such a stupid discourse. But then some metal magazines picked it up, and it became a story. And when you Googled him, it was all Okoy is a Nazi and so on. So he had to publish a statement on Facebook, and he wrote a quite beautiful long statement telling about his family history, revealing, for instance, that his father was black. Which all the guys who wrote, he's another white guy with, no, you cannot say he's a white guy without asking and without doing research. What is white anyway? So, okay. So he outlined this. He spoke out against racism and sexism and anything. But he did not feel comfortable with this because it's kind of it can be understood as a sort of virtue signaling. Because everybody has to do it now, speaking out against this, speaking out against that. just because people don't do their homework anymore, researching and speaking with people and treating them seriously rather than like throwing accusations. So he did that, and he argued that it's precisely what you stated, it's an old symbol, it's used in cultures throughout the world. And what the Nazis did is they appropriated it, but they also twisted it, you know? So they do not use the same symbol as in Buddhist temples, but they turn it a little bit into the right direction. Yeah? So he not even used that kind of a swastika. So a swastika, I would say, is not a Hakenkreuz. And you cannot say like everybody with a white skin color or is now not allowed to use swastikas anymore. Even in India, you will find like many people with like very light skin color, and it's very hard to differentiate in the first place, and so on and so on. So my answer is, I think it is wrong to kind of like cancel or ban the swastika. I think it is right to ban like the Hakenkreuz from in Germany or in any democratic country, because the Hakenkreuz, the way the Nazis used it, that is a very precise context. So, and if you do not recontextualize it, and if you do not use it in a sort of artistic or intellectual project in a way, then it's kind of difficult. But the swastika, no.
But how do you see how we can take away the aesthetic or some symbols from these political movements when we existing in the cancel culture and the Twitter policy? How it can work?
You have to do it. People are afraid now very much. They are afraid of being cancelled. They're afraid of being put into like the wrong box. But I think as long as they are afraid, and as long as they, withdraw and hide and no longer use this or that, I think nothing will change then. Then it means that these reactionary right-wing groups, they have the power to determine what this or that symbol means. So the only way to change that is to reappropriate it and put it in new context. I would not recommend to do it in a stupid way. So just like go around with a swastika like in the streets like a hello, but to create contexts. Yeah? Or, like Leibach have been doing this for many years, using like the totalitarian aesthetic. But then it was clearly a part of an art project, and everybody who did a little research could find out.
Rammstein is a good example.
Rammstein as well, yeah. So many Motorhead, for instance. Well, my favorite band. Yours too? No. Okay. But yeah, question or
I want to put a question. Seeing the points from your conclusion, I assume that you are quite familiar with the works of Ernesto Laclau or Chantal Mouffe.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes, and my question is, do you think the answer to the so-called rightist populism, which is often used in liberal media, is the leftist populism?
No, because I don't believe in this fight fire with fire strategies. And it's still, because this is still rooted in kind of like mimicking the opponent. If they use populism, then we need populism too. So they still determine what methods you use somehow. And I would rather opt for what I meant by like point 5, rather working on a more subtle level, not on a symbolic level so much, but creating stable social bonds in real life that prevent people from becoming radicalized. And educating and informing and discussing so that people can also understand how these guys operate. So this, I would prioritize this a lot. And I'm a little bit skeptical with left-wing populism. And I differentiated this morning between popular and populist. For me, and also from political theory, whatever theories, serious theories you read about populism, They mostly define populism as a divisive style. And I'm not into like scenarios of harmony. I don't believe that democracy is like everybody's like hippie-ish, like loving each other. This does not exist in an open society. But I believe that being divisive is just as bad as striving for total harmony. So I would rather try to connect in the long-term perspective differences in a way that they can somehow relate without, without fighting and destroying each other. So, if that makes any sense. I know that like Chantal Mouffe, she has a different understanding of populism, obviously. Yeah, I think in this regard, I would actually subscribe to what she argues. I think one has to become loud, yes, and visible, and not hide away. But I think the methods should differ from the methods that these populists use. So I come from, philosophically speaking, I come from John Rawls' theory of justice. And John Rawls, he argues that he very much proceeds from just and fair methods. And quite often people have just and fair aims in life, but they use unfair methods to achieve them. And I don't believe that this works in the long run. So I think the methods, how you work, how you do activism, they have to be just and fair.
And also, we talked a lot about how the right appropriate the left stuff and so on. But don't you think that part of the good is also on the left because we dissociated ourselves or we turned our backs toward, for example, the working class?
Sure.
We are not speaking because, for example, people like Melanie will still be qualified as liberals here in post-Soviet countries.
Yes.
Here you can speak about, for example, animal rights, about LGBT rights, you can speak about all the niceties and stuff, but you will rarely see someone speaking about like, public spaces, like workers' rights and so on. And I think that we actually should also speak about how, because the right is also, the right ideology is always based like on fear.
Yeah,
for example, when the working class is living in precarity, they don't have like safety at their work, and they're always threatened with outsourcing their money, with paying someone in a labor camp in Bangladesh or China working for less money, and they will also say thank you to you for this. And I don't know, I think this is like one of the main issues that we didn't address.
No, I fully agree with your diagnosis. In order for the far right to win, there have to be some mistakes on the left progressive side as well. You can see that in Italy, it's quite interesting. In Italy, you have entire regions who traditionally voted left that now switch to the right. So this is not because they are eternal fascists. No, like Umberto Eco coined this term of the eternal fascism. So no, under concrete circumstances, in concrete situations, they made a choice. So, like calling them out as fascists and so on, yes, you can do it, but I think it brings you nowhere. It's rather, I think, it's better to do a thorough analysis of what oneself has been doing wrong as well, and then work on that constructively rather than only fighting the opponent, because that takes away all your energy that you need to improve yourself. And I think one thing that the contemporary left could do in order to improve is not to be led by fear. I have the feeling, or I have the sense, that much of the debates and the new topics that are discussed now are really based on fear, like fear of certain terms, fear of certain aesthetics, fear of certain words. And so you try to keep that out, and not to confront yourself with that. And here I would say like fear is simply not a good advice giver. And in this regard, I agree with your analysis. Yes. In order for the right to succeed in certain areas, there had to be some mistakes on the left as well, especially since they came to power. Because, I mean, the left is no longer the left of the 19th century. We have like left-wing governments, and we had many, and we have many in Europe. So we can no longer argue these are like the poor, suppressed ones. No, they are in power themselves. So.
I wonder what you think about this kind of a creative reappropriation of certain kind of right-wing symbols, militarism, of guns, and how this has a role to play as well of kind of taking them out of that context. Maybe that's kind of what I'm trying to do in my practice, and I'm wondering if that's, because I noticed that's a trend as well in some online kind of spaces where they collage, say, for example, Kim Kardashian together with some kind of over-the-top huge car, but it's all done ironically and kind of diffuses this militarism and maybe it diffuses this ideologies. And that's,
yes.
I think that has a role to play.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's actually good. I think in any case it's good if you don't give your political opponent the power to determine what means what. So if you bring something back, if you take something back, that's something valuable in the first place. What I would not recommend is to only do that, because it still remains in a close relationship or in some sort of like dependency on your political opponent. And I don't say political enemy, I say like political opponent. So if you always derive what you are doing from your political opponent, rather than creating something original and authentic yourself, you never really get away from this relationship of dependency, of serfdom.
This is kind of an offensive technique. It's not. It's a defensive.
Defensive technique, exactly. Yeah. So I would always use these strategies and tactics of like taking things back, but at the same time, I would always try to create something that is valuable and substantial in itself. Yeah. And that is the best thing you can do. That is the best thing that the left has done in history. I mean, creating unions. That's a very constructive thing to do. Yeah? And there was need. Not that unions are always good and that they always make a good job. They do shit as well. But in principle, it's good that they organized. Yeah? And that they assembled some power for themselves. Or like health insurance systems. That everybody has health insurance. That's so basic, that's so important. Access to libraries, stuff like this. I think this is the main stuff that people should focus on now.
But I say it kind of becomes more difficult under this technological conditions that we live in. And in certain sense, because we are getting more alienated and these algorithms are getting better, and it seems like that it's necessary to have both. I guess that we need to be present on this in these alienated spaces, because most of the people spend most of their time there. Yeah. And it's kind of, the technology is kind of driving us to be more alienated, and even if we push to have more spaces and so on, people still going to prefer to stay at home, and most of them. Yeah.
And at the same time, I agree with the diagnosis. At the same time, I have the feeling that we right now have to somehow like leave the rabbit hole again. For instance, I discovered, observing myself, is I'm buying the local newspaper now again. Like for many years, I did not buy a local newspaper. Now, I started like 1.5 years ago. So, and I'm reading it. And because it gives me information about very concrete, nearby stuff that I can actually go and I can check if it's right or wrong, if it's false, fake news or whatsoever. And I think it becomes increasingly important to, in parallel to what you just said, to develop like non-network, non-online based communities, because they're much more relevant and stable than like this online stuff. I have like a couple of thousand followers on Twitter, but do they actually follow me? If I vanish from the scene, they will forget me within like 2-3 days. But if I have like a rather personal on the ground network stuff like you are doing here, also in this context, I think it has much stronger impact and relevance. Still, I would say.
I think there's going to be there is some kind of movement of people going offline. I think a few days ago there's offline day. And that's probably going to be a trend that's going to develop. But still, now the majority of people's time is spent, of young people especially.
Yeah.
I agree. Also, I find this is kind of important in this period of time, maybe in the future when there will be less time spent online. It seems like you have to meet with people where they are at the same time.
Oh, but I agree. That for me was the reason to go on Twitter, like many years ago, because I really observed that there is a new public over there, and they are heavily influencing also traditional media. So basically now when you read traditional media, they're basically culturally appropriating Twitter. I read some shitstorm on Twitter, 2 days later it's on the front pages of every newspaper, at least in the online editions. So they really draw from this. So as a journalist or as a cultural critic, I had to feel, okay, I have to participate there. I cannot leave that to the others. So I engage there. But it's a pain in the ass job. It's time consuming and it costs a lot of nerve. And I really don't know if it's so substantial in the end. But I do it myself. Counter speech and providing different content than like the troll stuff, the identitarian stuff that circulates there.
I wanted to share a gossip that I heard a couple of months ago that the Ministry of Culture, Moldovan Ministry of Culture, wanted to create another coalition of, I think, independent cultural sector, like alternative to this coalition. But they didn't. Okay. They didn't do this yet. Because we are not so friendly with them.
Okay. But I mean, that would make sense from the perspective of a government, no? To create a independent cultural
They have already the unions. The unions
exactly.
are like independent, but under the ministry.
So, but then again, like in terms of branding, it would be much more sexy to have another independent that really is labeled as independent. So, but I mean, this is, we talked about this during lunch. This is like how in Western neoliberal societies, this is how it goes all the time. Like all these progressive counterculture movements are embedded. I once wrote an article called The Embedded Artist. So using that term like from the Gulf War, the embedded journalist, and transferring it to the artists. So the critical artist is now embedded. He or she is asked to criticize. So, problematic. State-paid anarchists.
Yes, anarchists, capitalists.
They exist as well. The libertarians, like Silicon Valley, they're inspired by anarchism. But again, they use it for their own purposes. This is what I mean. There is no ism that guarantees anything. You can use socialism for totalitarian purposes. No worries. It has been proven throughout history. You can use liberalism for illiberal purposes. You can use like conservative purposes for completely non-conservative purposes. I think like conservatives, they should be the ecologists now. Now ecological stuff is so conservative in itself, like preserving the planet, the climate, human race, and so on. That should be an issue of conservatives, but it is not. I mean, it's like it's human beings. So what do you expect? Exactly. Religion, the Christians, my favorite example. I'm bashing the Christians today. All day long I've been bashing the Christians. Actually, I like the Christian religion a lot because I think it's really a progress to have a religion where the main hero is an unemployed carpenter. I mean, this is really, it's a great innovation, yeah? Usually you have like in Buddhism, Buddha was a prince, no, Aristotle 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 was a prince. In like Hinduism, you have all the superheroes, and the Christians have a guy who is a complete loser. So he managed, he completed, succeeded, nothing. Yeah? In the end, he failed. And then you have to transform that failure into like this big religion, which is really amazing. Yeah? So transforming that loser religion into a world religion with like the Vatican, and the Pope, and Crusades, and everything, amazing story. Yeah? But the Christians, good example. They started all this stuff. Hippies, hanging out in the desert, talking about justice, long hair. And then a couple hundred years later, state religion, like fighting the heathens and so on. So there is no ism that protects us. No religion, nothing. We can just continue do stuff. Yeah.
It's not a question. I want to bring up the topic of the war in Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
There's an interesting debate I've been following in civil society channels in Ukraine about the use of curse word. So when referring to Russian soldiers. So this curse word is pidor. So Russian pidors, and pidor is a derivative of homosexual. So for them, but of course this word took a wider meaning, which basically means a nasty person. The debate was about the LGBT community in Ukraine, saying that hey, we associate ourselves where this word is used to basically discriminate against us, and they're saying that it's not really okay to say because it normalizes the word and it promotes this sort of discriminatory language, and that there are many other words you can call Russian aggressors, whatever, than this word. And also given the context that now there is a significant segment of LGBT community in active combat, serving in the Ukrainian armed forces and so on. So what is your take on this? Where do we draw the line? Or should we allow a country that is at war defending itself to pick their language?
I think first of all, we don't have the power to stop anybody from doing this. This is probably something that could only be done by the Ukrainian government, and maybe not even they have the power, obviously, to censor their citizens on full scale. So for very pragmatic reasons, we cannot stop that. But I think every act of appropriation needs a context, and it needs a sort of like strategy, and it needs a consciousness. So if you try to redefine terms, or if you try to redefine symbols, then you have to have a plan. Like just using them, and then saying, well, yeah, but they can also be understood in this or that way, is a stupid thing to do. So the example of Bölzer, the Swiss metal band, like his swastika tattoos, they are embedded in a context. So he has tattoos all over his body. That's the context. And he has like mythological symbols from various regions of the world. So if you isolate them, then you can have like an uproar, but it doesn't make sense. It's not fair. So whenever I think when you use such a terminology, when you use such words, you should actually explain and contextualize why you do it. And I mean, the queer movement has done precisely this. They have appropriated the term queer, which was a derogatory term. So they have used it, and they have turned it against the original intention. So if people use this in such a way, then it would make sense. But using it for Russian soldiers, I'm not sure if that's the right context. So there would have to be some really intricate conceptual shift and twist to legitimize this. So why you use particularly this term and not another term, as you also stated. And this is why I mean, if you do it, you have to have a context, you have to know why you do it.
Because the word is powerful.
Yeah. But then again, this is, I think, the same issue with populism. Yeah? I would, sometimes I would always choose my weapons well. And just because something is powerful does not mean that I have to use it. If I use all the time the stuff that is most powerful, then we have a total war all the time. Because everybody uses the most powerful language, the most powerful tools, the most powerful weapons. And then Putin says, okay, I'll use the most powerful stuff too, and throws the atomic bomb. So if that is the legitimation, like the legitimatory discourse, that you always have to use the most powerful stuff, I'm not in. I would argue that you have to use the smartest stuff. And the Ukrainians, that is interesting, they succeed where they act smart. In terms of warfare at the moment, they are very successful when they use unconventional, innovative, we talked about this in the morning, kind of anarchist strategies. This makes them strong at the moment, plus weapons, advanced weapon systems and so on, of course. Yeah? But just using it because it is powerful, that's like somewhere on the sky.
We say here that we call sometimes other people like after animals, like pig, or we say here that sometimes humans are worse than animals. So it's like, but no offense.
You are saying that you drink like a pig or you get drunk like a pig, and I never saw a drunk pig.
Elephants sometimes get drunk.
They are going crazy. Yes, no, they are going to sleep.
After a while, they fall to the side.
Monkeys too.
Yeah, monkeys too. Yeah, they take drugs. Animals take drugs as well. Some.
Not cats.
Not cats. No. They're straight edge. But does it make sense? Like the answer? I think one could do it, but then it really has to have a concept. And people would have to understand that it is meant in a very intricate, complicated, conceptual way. And usually these terms are not used in that way.
In transactional. Intersectional.
Intersectional. That would be like a transsectional way.
Intersectional people.
Should maybe stop here?
Yeah, but battery is low, so.
Thank you very much for sharing with us your
Thank you.